A dirty man, invisible to the eyes of the world, plays a song that no one recognizes, except for a stranger passing by in a hurry, who freezes in the middle of the sidewalk. That melody wasn't just sound, it was memory. It was a scar. And behind it, there's a pain that runs through 3 generations of the same family without anyone ever having the courage to name it. The musician? A homeless man forgotten on the corners of Chicago. The well-dressed man? A successful businessman who spent his life trying to erase any trace of his past. What they didn't know is that the past never disappears. It just waits for the right song to come back. And when it does, it doesn't ask for permission. This is the story of Samuel Brooks, a self-taught musician, kidnapped as a child and forgotten by everyone. It's also the story of Marcus Harrison, a man who built his identity by stepping on the wounds he swore he didn't have. One never had anything, but kept the sound. The other had everything, but no longer recognized his own voice. They crossed paths by chance, or maybe not. Because sometimes destiny hides in the details we overlook, like an old guitar, a cold corner, or a song that insists on surviving. You will meet Evelyn, a 90-year-old grandmother who never gave up waiting. You'll understand the weight of a faith that doesn't shout, but resists in silence. You'll see how prejudice can be born within the home itself, and how the wounds we ignore are the ones that shape who we become. This is not a story of easy victories. It's a story of painful reunions, of mistakes that return, and of truths that bleed but set us free. Because sometimes what hurts also saves. Get ready to watch pride crumble in the face of truth. To see a man who mocked a street musician discover that he was mocking his own blood. This story will show you that success without roots is just a facade, and that time demands sooner or later what we bury alive. It doesn't matter how high you've climbed in life, if you forget where you came from, you will fall from a much higher place. Samuel and Marcus didn't choose to meet, but they chose what to do with that truth. And that's where everything changes. Because in the end, what defines a family isn't just the name. It's who stays when the shame passes. It's who holds the other's hand even after everything. And it's who decides to listen even when the music seems to have stopped. This story doesn't begin with an embrace. It begins with a confrontation. But what happens next can change everything.
Before diving into this exciting story, we want to make sure you don't miss out on any of our incredible content. If you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, now is the perfect time to do so. By subscribing, you'll become a valued member of our growing community, where we share amazing stories, insightful lessons, and much more. Don't wait any longer. Hit that subscribe button now and join us on this amazing journey.
The cold wind of Chicago sliced through the air like a razor on that gray morning. The damp asphalt reflected the light from the street lamps that still stood, despite the shy sun trying to rise. On the corner of a busy street, a man with a scruffy beard, deep-set eyes, and calloused hands held an old guitar. Worn wood, strings hastily replaced but tuned with soul. Samuel Brooks sat slowly on an overturned milk crate, adjusted the thin blanket over his shoulders, and played the first note as if the sound came from the scars on his skin. There was no hat on the ground, no hope for coins. There was just him and the music. The melody Samuel played was unfamiliar. It was a deep lament, almost whispered, interrupted by long pauses, as if each chord needed permission to exist. Passers-by, in a hurry, didn't notice. Those who did looked away. A child even smiled but was pulled by the hand of her mother before she could get too close. Between one chord and the next, Samuel closed his eyes as if he were playing for someone who was no longer there, or perhaps had never been. A whole world crumbled inside that man, but only the wood of the guitar knew this. And it listened, without judgment. On the other side of the street, behind a spotless storefront with ads for smartphones and tablets, Marcus Harrison watched, arms crossed, a stern expression, chin slightly raised, as if evaluating something out of place. The sound of the music subtly invaded his sterilized environment, cutting through the silence of the air conditioning with something he couldn't name. "This kind of thing scares off customers," he murmured to himself, as the reflection in the glass returned his image, dressed for success. But there was something about that melody, something that bothered him, as if it were a memory he didn't know where it came from. "Does he come here every day?" he asked one of the employees, not taking his eyes off the street. "Almost always. Plays in that corner. Never bothers anyone, but stays there," she replied, with some disdain. Marcus nodded, but his gaze remained fixed. The sound that once seemed like street noise now started to seem familiar. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. Must be a coincidence. But the melody continued, and each note seemed to knock on some old door inside him. One he swore he had locked years ago. Samuel outside played with wet eyes. It wasn't because of the cold or the hunger. It was for something he couldn't even name. Sometimes he thought he played for his mother, the one he barely remembered the face of. Other times, he thought he played for himself as a child, trying to remember where he came from. But that day there was something different in the air. It was as if an invisible presence was truly watching him. And that scared him. Because deep down, Samuel never believed anyone would ever see him as a human being again. The music ended with a suspended cord hanging in the air. Silence. No applause, no coins. Just the sound of cars in the background, and Samuel's heavy breathing. He lowered the guitar, as if returning the burden to the world. On the other side of the street, Marcus turned and walked back into the store, but not before throwing one last glance over his shoulder. The expression on his face was no longer cynical. It was somewhere between irritation and restlessness. Something inside him had been poked, and he hated that. But Samuel didn't know this. He simply picked up the guitar, as if carrying an invisible cross, and walked to the other side of the block where the cold was stronger, and where no one knew his name. Marcus Harrison had always believed that success was armor, and on the outside it seemed to work. At 45, the owner of one of the most modern stores in the neighborhood, specializing in smartphones, laptops, and cutting-edge tablets, he was the epitome of the black progress many celebrated. Always wearing a neatly pressed shirt, an imported watch on his wrist, and a ready-made speech on meritocracy. But inside there were cracks he didn't even have the courage to face. To Marcus, the past was a mirror he kept turned to the wall, and poverty, a scarecrow he made sure to keep far from his storefront. The store was located in a prime area in the west side of Chicago, where organic cafes and boutique gyms competed for space with luxury pet shops. There, Marcus personally served the most demanding customers, always with a technical smile and carefully calculated words. "Here, technology transforms lives," he'd say, almost like a mantra. But he didn't truly believe that. What transformed lives, in Marcus's mind, was distance. Distance from suffering, from dirt, from misery. And for that, he was willing to do anything. Even erase what was inside of him. His relationship with family had faded over time. Growing up alongside his mother, Jay, and his grandmother, Evelyn, was never synonymous with deep affection. There was always a silence hanging over the house, a kind of hidden pain he never quite understood and never wanted to understand. It was like an old crack in the wall. You pretend it doesn't exist, paint over it, and move on. Marcus didn't ask questions. Jay avoided sensitive topics. Evelyn, immersed in faith, never complained but never smiled for real either, and he preferred to keep his distance from all of that. He became a man, he worked, he succeeded, and with that he distanced himself. However, the facade of success required constant upkeep. Marcus walked through the aisles of the store like an inspector of his own pride. He controlled the temperature, the uniforms, the volume of the ambient music. And above all, he watched the street. Anything that deviated from the image of progress was considered a threat. That's why Samuel bothered him so much. A black man, dirty, with an old guitar, right in front of his store playing melancholic melodies as if the city were a stage for his pain. To Marcus, that was unacceptable. This kind of thing holds the neighborhood back, he said to a group of shopkeepers the night before, drinking coffee at a nearby bakery. They all agreed, some out of fear, others out of interest, but most out of convenience. We need to maintain order, Marcus continued, not realizing he was speaking about human beings as if they were urban waste. Deep down, he believed he was right. He believed he was protecting something. But what he was trying to protect was a lie that he had won on his own, without carrying the pains of those who came before. The next morning, Marcus arrived early at the store. Samuel's guitar could already be heard in the distance, and for the first time he hesitated before unlocking the glass door. There was something in that sound that made him nauseous, not because of the melody itself, but because of what it did inside him. It was as if someone was gently tapping at his memory, asking, "Do you still know who you are?" And he didn't know how to answer. The city woke up in a rush, but Samuel continued at the same slow pace of someone who had learned to breathe differently. Sitting in the corner of the sidewalk, with his guitar on his lap and his eyes downcast, he felt the weight of indifference pass by in the form of hurried footsteps. The cold wind blew between the buildings like an ancient whisper, and Samuel's fingers, though dry and trembling, still found the strings as if searching for comfort. Each note was a piece of him trying not to fade away. That day he hadn't eaten, nor had he slept. But the music was still there. And that was all. On the other side of the street, Marcus watched again, this time with more anger than contempt. Samuel's presence had become an open wound in his territory. The modern store, the smiling attendants, the cutting-edge posters, everything clashed with the image of that ragged man holding an instrument. He couldn't understand how someone could keep coming back to the same place every day, invisible, rejected, ignored. "This isn't a shelter, it's a commercial zone," he muttered, slamming the door behind him. That same afternoon, Marcus met with some local shopkeepers. They sat at the back of a gourmet coffee shop, between espressos and lavender cakes. "He has to get out of there. He's driving away customers. Isn't what we see on TV enough?" one said, fiddling with his phone. "That guy only brings insecurity," another added. Marcus, with his sharp tongue and inflated ego, led the chorus. "If he wants to play, let him play somewhere else in the city. This is a clean zone." They didn't know Samuel's name, nor did they want to. To them, he was just another obstacle in human form. At the end of the conversation, between mockery and ideas, Marcus had an epiphany. He turned to his colleagues and said, almost as a challenge, "Let's see if he's really a musician, or just another drunk with a guitar." They laughed. One of them suggested, "Dare him to play something real." Marcus smiled with a cruel gleam in his eyes. The next morning, he approached Samuel for the first time. He stopped in front of him, arms crossed, and said loudly so others could hear, "If you're really a musician, play the song that marked your life, the one no one forgets." Samuel slowly raised his eyes. He looked at Marcus with curiosity, but didn't respond. Silence. Then, as if an old memory had been whispered by the wind, he ran his fingers over the strings and began to play. A soft, deep, almost sacred melody. It was like a lullaby wounded by time. And as he played, his eyes filled with tears. Because that music wasn't just music. It was a call, a memory, an old promise the world had forgotten. But he hadn't. Marcus, who had already turned to enter the store, froze mid-motion. His shoulders stiffened, his eyes widened, though he didn't realize it. There was something in those notes, something that sounded familiar. He couldn't remember where or when, but that melody touched a hidden corner inside him, a corner he thought was buried. For a moment, the noise of the city faded. There was only that sound and a sudden emptiness. And it was in that instant unknowingly that Marcus began to dig his own trap. The melody continued to flow, even as Samuel's hands trembled from the cold and from the memory. His eyes half closed seemed to aim at a distant past, as if searching in the present street for the shadows of a childhood that had been ripped away from him. The sound wasn't just music, it was a confession. Each chord was laden with longing, with absence, with something that never had a chance to grow. He didn't know what that song was still doing inside him, but he knew it was all that was left of who he once was. Marcus stood motionless in front of the store's door. The sound, as soft as it was, seemed to cut through the glass walls like a razor. That music, he had heard it before. Not on the radio, not at a concert. It was more intimate than that. It was from childhood, as if it were trapped in some corner of his mind waiting to be freed. His whole body reacted, but reason refused to accept it. Coincidence, just that, he whispered to himself, trying to convince a pride that was beginning to crack. From behind the counter, an employee watched him, confused. "Is everything all right, Mr. Harrison?" Marcus didn't answer. He didn't even hear her. The music was on loop inside him, rummaging through drawers locked for decades. Blurred memories came in flashes. The warm lap of his grandmother, a woman sitting at the piano, and the same melody softly sung in a low voice, as if it were a family secret. But he had never connected the dots. It had been buried somewhere, along with everything he thought he no longer needed. On the sidewalk, Samuel finished the song with an air of weariness that seemed to carry centuries. He put the guitar away with an almost sacred care, as if returning a relic to its box. He didn't know what it had caused on the other side of the street. To him, playing was just surviving another day without losing his mind. He had no idea that his music had awakened ghosts, or that one of them was watching him with eyes full of confusion and something like fear. Samuel simply stood up and kept walking, dragging his feet as if carrying the world on his soles. Marcus went back inside the store, his eyes lost. He closed the door slowly without saying a word. He stood still for a few seconds, staring at the white wall in front of him. He tried to regain his usual composure, but there was a discomfort that kept him from taking control again. It wasn't just the music. It was the feeling that something was wrong with the story they had told him, or the one he had preferred not to hear. The name Samuel still meant nothing to him, but the music, it spoke for itself. And in the silence of that spotless store, something inside him whispered, "This story isn't just about him, it's about you too." Evelyn Harrison's house was simple, but it withstood time as if carrying old promises within its walls. The rusty gate creaked like a lament, and the small front garden, though modest, held pots with tiny flowers, tended to with trembling hands and silent faith. At 90 years old, Evelyn moved slowly, but her gaze retained the firmness of someone who never allowed pain to turn her bitter. Her worn Bible always stayed beside the sofa, and the crucifix hanging on the wall was the only thing that had never moved. Time there didn't pass. It waited. Jay, her daughter, was making tea in the kitchen. The two had lived together for several years, sharing silences and memories that were never fully spoken. There was an absence in the house that not even the years could fill. A name that was rarely mentioned aloud but lingered in the air like an old perfume. Samuel. He had disappeared when he was just a boy, and since then, Evelyn had never slept soundly again. Her body aged, but her soul remained frozen on that day. Every day, Evelyn repeated the same ritual. She woke up early, watered the plants, lit a candle, and whispered, "Wherever he is, Lord, take care of my boy." The words were not rehearsed. They came out like breath. Jay watched from a distance, her heart tightening, knowing that her mother had never gotten over that loss. Many times she tried to change the subject, to talk about other things, but Evelyn always returned to the same point, to the waiting, to the idea that God had not finished that story, that there was still a reunion to come. Samuel's disappearance was like a crack that divided generations. Jay grew up with a piece of her brother missing and learned to deal with the pain in automatic mode, pretending normality. When Marcus was born, she tried to protect him from that past, but she could never completely hide the shadow that hung over the family. Evelyn never spoke of hatred. She never blamed anyone. She just waited. As if waiting in itself was a form of faith. That afternoon, while Marcus was struggling with an internal conflict he couldn't name, Evelyn sat on the porch, embroidering a cloth with blue flowers. Her tired fingers traced the edges of the petals, but her thoughts were far away. "Today marks exactly 45 years, she murmured. Jay heard from the hallway but didn't respond. She knew her mother didn't want conversation. She wanted silence. She wanted someone to listen to her without interrupting. And time did that very well. On the other side of the city, Marcus was still trying to shake off the strange feeling that the music had caused him. But something inside him was beginning to stir, and unknowingly, he was preparing to return to the origin of a familiar pain that he had never allowed himself to feel. Marcus was not a man easily affected. He had always believed that emotion was a weakness, a luxury he couldn't afford. But in the days following that morning in front of the store, the melody kept hammering in his head. It came from nowhere, between one sale and the next, as if someone were whispering old notes into his ear. He tried to ignore it, tried to rationalize, but there was a different urgency to that unease, as if time were collecting a forgotten debt. On a night with a light rain, Marcus decided to visit his mother. The house was the same as it had been during his childhood, with the old furniture, the smell of lavender in the air, and the sound of soft prayers coming from Evelyn's room. Jay greeted him with a restrained smile. "You came without calling. Is everything okay?" He hesitated. He didn't want to seem shaken. He didn't know how to say what he was feeling. "I wanted to ask you something," he said, sitting on the sofa. "That song that Grandma used to sing, do you remember it?" Jay furrowed her brow, surprised. "Which one? That old one from the piano? The soft one? The sad one?" Silence fell over the room like a thick fog. Jay looked at the floor, then at the crucifix on the wall. "That one was from our family. Mom learned it from her mother and passed it down to us. Only the children knew how to play it." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "Did you teach it to anyone else?" "No. Only Samuel knew. After he left, Mom never played it again." The mention of the name that was rarely spoken made Marcus's breath falter for a second. "Samuel? Your uncle. He disappeared when he was little. You were just a baby when the pain was still very fresh around here." It was as if someone had pulled a curtain aside. Marcus stood up and began to pace the room in circles. The name, the melody, Samuel's presence on the street. Everything was starting to align like pieces of a puzzle he never knew existed. "You said only he knew that song?" "Yes. Why?" Marcus hesitated. His pride fought against the truth, but the discomfort was greater. "There's a homeless man. He plays that song. The same one. Exactly the same." Jay's eyes widened, speechless. The information hit Jay like a silent lightning strike. She stood up pale. "Are you sure?" "Yes, I heard it at the store the other day. He's always there. Always in the same spot." Jay put her hands to her mouth, as if trying to contain something that was overflowing. "Marcus, could it be? I don't know, but something tells me it's not a coincidence." His mother nodded slowly. For the first time, the silence in the house was not just memory. It was a door that was finally beginning to open. Marcus returned home that night with a heavy heart. For the first time, the image of Samuel stopped being an inconvenience and became a quest. He needed to know who that man on the sidewalk was. He needed to know what life had made of him. But more than that, he needed to know what he himself had done by ignoring him for so long. The day broke with a thick fog over Chicago, as if the sky itself hesitated to reveal what was to come. Marcus walked through the streets like someone carrying a weight they didn't understand. His steps were slow, his head down, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel in control of anything. The image of Samuel playing the family song wouldn't leave his mind. It was no longer just an annoyance, Mo. It was an echo demanding an answer. Something inside him said, "Go all the way, even if it hurts." When he arrived at his mother's house, Evelyn was already awake, sitting in the armchair with the Bible in her lap. She looked at him calmly, but her eyes noticed the unease. "You came early, son." "I need to see the family album, Grandma, the old one, with the pictures of Uncle Samuel." Evelyn didn't say anything for a moment. She simply got up, went to the hallway closet and pulled out a worn cardboard box. She handed it to him with care. Marcus sat at the table and began to flip through it slowly, as if each page were a thread pulling memories he never truly knew. There were pictures of a younger Evelyn, Jay as a teenager, and then a boy. Curly hair, big eyes, a shy expression. He was smiling, sitting next to Evelyn at the piano. The handwritten caption beneath the image, written in blue ink, said, "My Sam playing our song, 1974. Marcus froze. The face of that boy, now it made sense. He had already seen that look, not in the pages of the album, but on the sidewalks of the city. In the silent, dirty man he had tried to push away. It was him. It was Samuel. Jay entered the room and found her son motionless, holding the photo. "Did you find it?" "It's him, the homeless man. It's Uncle Samuel." Jay covered her mouth with her hand. Evelyn, from the corner of the room, closed her eyes and murmured, "Thank you, Lord." Marcus, in turn, felt the shame burn down his throat. "I tried to get him out of there. I was part of this." "You didn't know, son," Jay said with teary eyes. "But now you do, and there's still time." Marcus didn't answer. He took the photo, stood up, and left. He needed to find him. He needed to make it right. He went straight to the spot where Samuel used to stay. Nothing. He walked to the square, asked other homeless people, "Sam? We haven't seen him today." He circled the entire neighborhood, searched alleys, looked under awnings, passed by shelters, but Samuel was gone. The anguish grew in his chest like a delayed guilt. It was as if the reunion had been ripped from his hands at the last second. When night fell, and the city filled with artificial lights once again, Marcus found himself standing in the same place where Samuel used to play, alone. It was only at the end of the night, exhausted, that a homeless woman told him, "Sam, they took him yesterday. They said he tried to rob a store, but we know it was a setup. People in suits who never look you in the eye." Marcus closed his eyes and swallowed hard. He felt the ground give way. Samuel's arrest was the final point of what he had helped to begin, a trap he had set. And that now crushed his own conscience. And it was there, standing under the awning, holding the photo of the boy at the piano, that Marcus understood. Blood may be forgotten, but the truth always finds a way to return. The smell of bleach filled the air, mixed with sweat and the tense silence of the cells. Samuel sat in the corner of the local prison, his body hunched, his eyes red from poorly slept nights. His hands, which once strummed melodies, now trembled, with no strings to ease the pain. He didn't protest when they took him. He no longer protested anything. He had become accustomed to the idea of being guilty even before he existed. The prison was just another chapter in a book he was never allowed to write with his own words. It all happened quickly. 2 shopkeepers claimed he tried to break into a store. They said he threatened an employee. No one questioned it. The police arrived, handcuffed him, and removed him from the street as if sweeping the ground. One of them even laughed. "This guy already looks like trouble." Samuel didn't scream. He didn't defend himself. He just looked at the guitar he had left behind, thrown on the floor, cracked on the side. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the urge to recover it. Something inside him had broken along with the instrument. Marcus received the confirmation. The next morning, documents, police reports, false witnesses, all arranged quickly for convenience with indifference. He read each line like someone reading their own sentence. He knew it was his fault, maybe not directly. But his voice had opened doors. His disregard had authorized others to act. And now, the man he had discovered to be his uncle was caged as if he were nothing. Marcus couldn't breathe properly. The walls of the store seemed smaller. Success made him nauseous. He tried to visit Samuel, but the system made it difficult. "You need a lawyer, authorization, time," they said. "And if he's a relative?" he asked. The clerk's look was dry. "Can you prove it?" Marcus stepped back. Not yet, but he would. As he left the prison, the city seemed dirty, to him in a new way. Not because of the homeless, but because of the lie he had helped sustain. He walked for hours, aimless, trying to understand where he had gone wrong. And the answer was clear. When he decided to forget who he was. That night, he returned to Evelyn's house. His grandmother was weak, breathing with difficulty, but her gaze remained firm. "Did you speak to him?" she asked. Marcus kneeled in front of the armchair. "He's in prison." Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment. She didn't cry. She simply squeezed his hand. "Then go all the way, my son. Don't let my boy die like this again." Marcus nodded. For the first time, without pride, without masks. Just a man trying to fix what he had let break. And in that silence, which no longer weighed as it once had, Marcus understood that the time remaining needed to be used to make all that was lost worthwhile. Marcus spent the following days immersed in phone calls, meetings with lawyers, analyzing documents and contradictory testimonies. For the first time in years, he wasn't wearing a suit. He wore a sweatshirt and dark circles under his eyes. The store was closed and customers ignored. His world of status had been left behind. Now all that mattered was a name he had spent his whole life avoiding. Samuel. Not as a symbol of shame or inconvenience, but as part of himself. Blood of his blood. And for the first time, that meant something. The process was not easy. The false accusations were dismantled one by one, but the bureaucracy dragged on. Marcus went to court, brought the old photograph, explained who Samuel was, who he was, and who they had always been, even without knowing. The judge listened, the defense accepted, and by Friday afternoon, Samuel was released. He walked out, silently, his face marked by exhaustion, but his eyes still carried that dull shine of someone who had waited too long to believe in miracles. Marcus was waiting for him outside, standing with the restored guitar in his hands. "It's tuned," he said, trying to smile. Samuel hesitated. He took the instrument carefully. He didn't thank him, but he didn't refuse either. They stood, in silence for a few seconds, until Marcus said, "Grandma is still waiting for you." Samuel looked at him surprised. The name Grandma seemed out of place in his life, but at the same time, it felt right. They walked together through the city side by side, two figures who once represented opposite worlds, now bound by a scar of blood and time. When they arrived at Evelyn's house, Jay greeted them at the door. Her teary eyes recognized her brother even before any words were spoken. She hugged, Samuel with the strength of someone carrying 40 years of silence in her chest. Evelyn, sitting in the armchair, slowly raised her eyes. When she saw him, she smiled. She didn't say, "My son," nor "You're back." She simply said, "I knew." Samuel knelt in front of her and placed his head in her lap. And in that gesture, without a single word, all the lost time dissolved like snow touched by the sun. For a moment, the house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Jay prepared tea. Marcus stood still in the kitchen, watching the scene as if witnessing something sacred. The pain he had once pretended didn't exist now pierced him, and strangely brought peace. Because by recognizing Samuel, he wasn't just restoring the family, he was restoring himself. For the first time, he felt he belonged to something bigger than success, something that couldn't be measured by storefronts, but by forgiveness. And in that reunion, marked by silence and intertwined hands, Marcus understood. The roots he had tried to hide were exactly the ones that kept him standing. The house was silent, but it wasn't a sad silence. It was the kind that only exists when time finally fulfills a promise. Evelyn rested in her bed, more fragile than ever, but with a serene face. The reunion with Samuel had brought something that medicine could not offer: relief. Her breathing was light, as if she no longer needed to resist. Jay stayed by her side, holding her hand, and in the other room, Marcus and Samuel, sitting at the table, drank black coffee from chipped cups, as if they were childhood brothers trying to learn how to talk. Time doesn't erase everything, but sometimes it offers the chance to stitch together what was left open. Samuel was still a man marked by traumas, by the streets, by absences. But now there was something different in his gaze. He didn't speak much, but he listened attentively. Marcus, in turn, seemed simpler, less armed. He had left his pride on the sidewalk where he once tried to push his uncle away. "Will you play again?" he asked. Samuel shrugged. "I never stopped playing, just no one was listening." The silence that followed was more eloquent than any apology. 3 days later, Evelyn passed away. She slept peacefully, with the Bible open in her lap and the crucifix still hanging on the wall. Jay found her with a light smile on her lips, as if she had seen what she had longed for. The funeral was simple, with few people, but among the white flowers, what was seen was something greater than pain. It was gratitude. Marcus said a few words, but they were firm. She never gave up on him. And because she never gave up, I learned not to give up too. Samuel just leaned the guitar next to the coffin and stood in silence. It was his way of singing one last time for his mother. In the following week, Samuel began to live with Jay. The two rediscovered each other as siblings. Marcus, for his part, completely transformed his store. He formed a team to provide food and clothing for the homeless. He hired 2 assistants from poorer families. "Everyone has talent if they have someone who listens," he would say, now with a different voice. The storefront remained modern, but something in the atmosphere had changed. It was as if at last that display reflected a whole man, and not just his status. The last scene is on a Sunday afternoon. Samuel plays guitar at a small community event surrounded by children, mothers, and the elderly. Jay watches, smiling, and Marcus hands out water to the guests. At the end of the song, a little girl approaches and asks, "Is this song yours?" Samuel answers with a slight smile, "No, it's my mother's." The girl doesn't understand, but Jay, in the background, closes her eyes, because she knows. Sometimes love survives in the form of melody, and all it takes is for someone to listen. Marcus spent his life trying to distance himself from pain, but it was precisely by facing it head-on that he discovered who he truly was. It wasn't the degree, nor the shiny storefront that made him a man. It was the act of recognizing, kneeling, and listening. And Samuel's silence, and so full of weight and absence, ended up being the cry that set them both free. Sometimes the truth doesn't come shouting. It arrives in the rhythm of an old finger-picking, in the lines of a forgotten photo, or in the gaze of someone who's been abandoned so many times, they learned to expect nothing more. But they waited. This story wasn't about guilt, it was about courage. The courage to return, to take responsibility for what was neglected, to understand that dignity doesn't have a fixed address, nor does it depend on what you wear. Samuel didn't need charity, he needed to be seen. Marcus didn't need status, he needed to reconnect with what made him human. Evelyn didn't need a miracle, just a reunion. And it was in the union of these needs that the family finally was remade. Cracked, yes, but whole enough to move forward. How many people do you know who could be the Samuel of your street? And how many Marcus have you seen turn their face thinking they were protecting something, when in reality they were losing everything? Life has a subtle, and sometimes cruel, way of returning to us what we've buried. Sometimes out of love, sometimes out of pain, but always out of necessity. Because no one lives well without knowing where they came from. And those who don't listen to the sounds of the past risk repeating the same silences. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to our channel, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who needs to hear this. Because sometimes, all someone needs is for someone to stop and listen.